So there is this belief, isn't there, that if the government spends more, then that is going to help the poor rather than the wealthy. So you've got all those wealthy people who are paying into, quite healthy taxes at the top end, although perhaps less healthy than it has been in the past. All that money is being used to redistribute. Basically, taxation is actually being used as a redistribution exercise, and so the poor are benefiting from it all. Well, that might be the case, but it's not happening in a hurry. But so is it the case at all, in fact? So in the UK in 2023 to 24, the top 20% of households receive 36% of total disposable income, whereas the bottom 20% receive just 9%. So, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt, is there, Steve, in the West, there's this very big imbalance. And the political, where the rich are not necessarily getting richer, but they're maintaining that position. Certainly and the poor are getting less well off. And there seems to be, in times when, everyone seems to be struggling, particularly the people in the middle, there seems to be this belief just about everywhere that the government needs to get out of this game more, because what is holding back wealth creation, which will supposedly benefit everybody, is too much taxation by the government. So we've got this idea that it should be all more laissez-faire. I'm just wondering whether actually that's right or not. Maybe there's a case if the way the system works currently, we are helping the rich by government spending more.
Well, if you look where income tax came from, income tax only began after World War One, because before World War One, government spending was actually quite trivial. It's quite remarkable when you look at the figures. I've seen these for United States rather than for Europe. But the average level of government spending during the 19th century and up to the beginning of World War One was about 3% of GDP. Okay, trivial, 1/10 what we have.
So what were they
these
spending
days.
that on? So there was presumably there was no welfare. There's no national health service.
There was no welfare. There was no health provision. You pay for basically everything. It was basically the military and the police force. Okay, that was about all you really spent money on. And of course, you'd invade your neighbours and blow them up and stuff like that. That's always been a pretty important part of government activity. The 19th century has had as much warfare as any other century in human history. So it was basically financing the military side of the government, whether that's invading somebody else's country or policing your own. And that was about 3% of GDP, and that could actually be paid the way that Donald Trump thinks he could make the finance the government these days, largely by tariffed payments. So there was no income tax. So I'm not quite certain when it began. I think it was actually for World War II rather than for World War One. But the huge increase in spending from 2 or 3% of GDP to 20 or 30%, that then meant that the amount of government money being created was huge. And if you didn't take it out of circulation, you'd have a 20, 30% increase in the money supply each year. And though I'm part of the camp that says that what causes inflation is not the monetary system accommodates inflation. But with that level of money creation, you would have inflation caused by too much money. Taxation is necessary to take it out of circulation. And because the mindset was that the taxation pays for what the government does, we tax people for that. We don't we didn't go for a Gazellian idea of money where money deliberately depreciates. We don't tax transactions, we tax incomes. And that means everybody faces a slog out of what they earn from whether their jobs, whether they're private sector or public sector. They've got to pay a certain percentage of that. So it's of the order of 20 or 30% as well out of their income. And that nobody likes it. I think it's partly why we've had a right-wing shift in politics over time, an anti-government attitude, because you see the government hand going into your pocket, taking money out. You don't see it putting money into the other pocket.
But the more you're struggling, the more you feel that. So when the chips
are down,
the more
you feel it, and the working class and middle class in particular feel it. And they can't afford the lawyers and the tax agents and the offshore bank accounts that the rich can. So initially, you remember the old song "Tax Man" by the Beatles?
Yeah.
Okay. they were paying what, 90% tax rate. The marginal tax rate was absolutely enormous for them. Hence, they wrote the song Taxman. But now the marginal tax rate's been reduced. It's of the order of 40% maximum tax rate these days, rather than 90 as it was
or
back in the
45.
early days.
Yeah.
And what they've done is the rich have relocated their accounts offshore. They don't actually pay that tax, and the tax rate for the wealthy is probably lower than the effective tax rate for the poor, because the poor have got things like VAT, value added tax, at the bottom. So when the poor spend far more of their money on consumption than the rich do.
Yeah.
So if you look at the
Thanks
overall
for that,
tax burden,
Maggie.
yes, indeed, and John Howard in Australia, and
Mm.
God knows who. Sales tax is a state thing in the United States. It makes the taxes a lot higher than they actually appear transparently, because the units doing the taxation of sales isn't the federal government, it's the state governments. That confuses the numbers. But the basic story is the poor can't evade income tax and the rich can,
Yeah.
and therefore you get this huge bias, and the rich benefit. They're not paying anything like the tax that the poor are paying, and they're still getting the benefit of the government spending.
But if we go back to before, the wars, and there wasn't that degree of welfare, there wasn't an NHS, then people were worse off. There would be a big rich-poor divide. Although I guess, if you were employing people, and it was obviously much more labour intensive in those days, if you're employing people, you had to pay them enough for them to live off so that they could survive, so that they could buy your stuff. So, I mean,
But you had a higher growth rate, and a few of them could die, and you wouldn't care about it. You get the replacements later. I mean, all
mm,
this stuff. That public health uh, is a huge reason why we have the population growth we've had,
yeah.
because there used to be such high levels of death, child death in child labour, uh, death from early diseases. I think things called vaccines may have been beneficial, but I
Well,
don't really know
you're
anymore,
not one of
because
those
I've been
people who
listening.
believes in
Oh,
vaccines, are you,
oh
Steve?
God Almighty! What a fool I must
Yeah,
be.
yeah,
The fact that my father got polio and I didn't,
yeah.
it must be my dad. He mustn't have taken the right ivermectin, or whatever they call it. But yeah, the public, the huge growth in the welfare of the overall community has been as much by what the public sector provides as it has by what the private sector provides,
Right.
and that's the huge.
Okay, so that sounds like a very easy answer to the question then. Does government spending, I asked the question, does government spending help the rich more than it helps the poor? So at that one level, you'd say, well, no, clearly it's helping the poor because it's providing all of these services that didn't exist before. But if you keep on adding to that government spending, do we get to a stage? And the reason why I'm raising that question, you know why I'm going in this direction. So the government issues debt, it gets translated into bonds. Those bonds become part of the finance system. The people who are buying those bonds are either banks, or they're getting sold on into secondary markets where they're going into pension funds or whatever. They become part of the financial system. And the people who are benefiting from that financial system are not the poor, they are the wealthy. And those bonds have a percentage that's paid, the coupon rate, which gets paid by the
Mhm.
government, which is coming from government money, which is going to the top echelons of society, not paying for people's healthcare. So there's an argument, isn't there, that if you keep on increasing government debt, it's disproportionately going to help the wealthy.
Well, that's what's happening now, particularly
Mm,
the increase in interest rates from 1% to 5%. If you're buying bonds, if you buy government bonds, you're getting a guaranteed risk-free rate of return, and the buyers of those bonds initially are the banks themselves. But when the bonds are then sold to pension funds and to wealthy individuals, the income from those bonds goes to those pension funds and wealthy individuals, and it's a huge source of profit for them. So yeah, it's not the bonds per se. It's the sale by the bonds by the private banks who bought them in the initial primary auctions. The sale of those bonds to the non-bank private sector, and that's both wealthy individuals and non-bank financial institutions like pension funds, superannuation funds, insurance companies, and so on. And the beneficiaries there are the people who own those companies as well as the wealthy. So they're getting the benefit of interest payments by the government,
yeah.
and they're paying low tax, and they're getting a high return on the bonds that they buy. So yeah, that's this isn't just it isn't just a 20th century, 21st century phenomenon. You can see it back if you read, 19th century literature, the Jane Austens and et cetera, et cetera. When discussing a potential spouse, the discussion would be, how many bonds does he own?
Mm.
He's got large amounts of government bonds. So it's always been the wealthy that benefit from those bonds. And that comes down, raises an interesting question. Should the government sell the bonds at all to the private banks and then let the banks on sell them to the wealthy individuals?
And we
And I
know
don't think they should.
should well, but we know that is the norm, isn't it? Because we've
It is the
spoken
norm,
so
yeah.
many times about the fact that two ways money is added. Well, three ways money is added to the money supply. Sorry, MMT is, but the third one, let's get that one out of the way, is income from overseas. So I add to the UK money supply, for example, because I'm bringing in money. I'm charging, most of my money comes from Australia, so that comes into the UK,
Hmm.
adding to the UK money supply. The other one is the government creating money, but then that gets cancelled out if they issue bonds, and those bonds are bought by the private sector. So there's zero impact. And the other one is that governments give loans, and we know
Private banks give loans, yeah.
private banks give loans, and we know that the vast majority of money that is created is from private banks. Very little, like just a few percent, is coming from down that government road. So most of that government money is cancelled out by the issuing of those bonds. And
Yeah.
so
I mean,
and so
I
all
got
of that
quite a,
is being
yeah.
going into the finance sector, very wealthy people benefiting from it.
Yeah, I mean, I got quite a surprise. Richard Vague is
Mm.
a good friend of mine and a damn good an analyst of the financial sector. And Richard's group, Debt Economics, so that's a website I recommend people follow, debteconomics.org. Also Tycho, I think it's called Tycho, Tycho, as in TychoBray.org, where they do the data analysis. And they went through the numbers between 2000 and 2024 and said that you look at the increase in the money supply across that time, you would think from the debate about MMT and government spending and so on and so forth, that increase was mainly government money creation. But because of that potential for bond sales to cancel government money creation, it turned out that of the $16 trillion that was created in deposit accounts between 2000 and 2024, 90% of that was the private sector money creation. The government money creation is cancelled by what is done with the bonds. Even worse, you look between 1980 and 2000. Again, this is research you'll find on tycho.org. 140% of it was private sector. In other words, government money creation was actually cancelled, and it was actually a negative contribution to the increase in the money supply. So again, that's because the bonds are being sold by government treasury bonds are being sold by the banks to the non-bank private sector, and that purchase of bonds is done by you reduce your deposit account at the bank. That destroys money. That also means the bonds are transferred from the banking sector to the non-bank buyer, but that's actually destruction of government money creation. So
Mm.
that again is giving, and then the bonds, when they're owned by the non-bank sector, they're owned by the wealthy. So again, this is an income flow to the wealthy, not to the poor.
And then the way the tax system in the UK works out with ISAs, there's every incentive for you to do that. So you can put up to 20, that spare 20,000 that you have lying around every year. With it's most people, of course, most people have got £20,000 sitting
Oh
there that
yeah, yeah.
they're just wondering what to do with.
In my back pocket.
So that £20,000 you can put into an ISA, which you could use to buy those bonds. We could buy shares. You buy what you want with it as financial instruments, but you don't pay any capital gains or any money at all in tax. You don't even need to declare it on your tax return. That 20,000. So that's over 5 years. That's 100,000 that you can invest in bonds. So there's all of that is geared towards saying yes, buy up government debt. And governments would say, well, that's a good thing because that means people, there's demand for the debt that we are creating. And so that's a good thing. That becomes a reason for the government to spend even more if they wanted to. We don't have to worry about there being a lack. I mean, all of this gets down to the big fear, isn't it? If there's a lack of demand for bonds, then that's going to drop the price of those bonds, which is going to push up interest rates. That's going to increase the cost of borrowing. And that seems to be all they're concerned about.
And they're completely wrong about it. That's one of the things I'm trying to get political parties to realize, that they're getting the accounting wrong. Again, if you read an economics textbook, you're reading bad accounting. If I had to define what an economist is or a mainstream economist is, it's somebody who's a lousy accountant. Okay, somebody, if they did your accounts, they'd send you bankrupt immediately. That's the nature of mainstream economics. They have a completely mythical idea about how the accounting actually operates. So when you have the bond sales when the Treasury sells bonds, the purchases are done by people who have accounts not at private banks but at the central bank.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you've got a central bank account, I understand. Oh,
No,
you
they
don't?
refused it. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
well,
refused my
I thought I had,
application.
but I don't.
Mm.
Oh, gee, that means I can't buy government bonds
Yeah.
in the initial auction.
I
So
tried to
when
confuse
you
them by changing my name to Bank, uh,
Phil
Philip
Banky,
Bank, but they
Phil
did.
Banky, or Banky Phil.
Yeah,
Okay.
but
You
it
could
didn't
actually
work.
become a cartoon character. That'd be intriguing. But yeah, we cannot even get into the auctions. So the people who can get into the auction, or the institutions that can, have accounts at the central bank. And what's in those accounts is what we call reserves, and those reserves are created by the government deficit, and also created by quantitative easing, which of course is something that the government was forced into and directed into by economists when the financial crisis that they didn't see coming blew their government finances out of the water. So you have these huge issues of you have the central bank buying bonds off the um, off the private banks and off the non-bank financial institutions, and that means that in the past banks had very, very low level of reserves, just enough to meet what their statutory requirements were. Now, the level of outstanding reserves in the UK, and I've got to put a caveat here, I find it impossible to find decent data in the UK system. It's a pain in the ass going through the Office of National Statistics. You ask a question, you say, here are the 3,782 files that might be answer to your question. Do you want to look through the whole lot of them now? Bugger off. But anyway, when I had a look, it looked like the level of reserves in the UK system now are roughly equivalent to 30% of GDP. That's how many excess reserves that exist now because of quantitative easing. It's buying bonds back off the banks, back off the non-bank financial institutions. That's how much reserves are outstanding. Now, when the government runs a deficit and then it's required to issue bonds equivalent to the deficit plus the interest on existing bonds, and that it hasn't been anywhere near 10% of GDP. Government debt's about 100%, but the deficit's below 10% of GDP. Let's say it was actually 10% of GDP. How many auctions are there per year? There's roughly an auction every 2 or 3 days.
Mm.
So there's roughly 100 auctions over a year. Now, they vary radically in size depending upon the time in the tax cycle and all that sort of stuff. But on
and
average,
the
that
longevity
means
of the bonds. Yeah.
yeah. But that means the average level of sales in each auction is about 0.1% of GDP. That means that the amount of reserves that exist, and those are the accounts out of which people buy bonds, is roughly 300 times the amount of funds that are necessary to buy the bonds. Now, when the
But if
bonds
there's
offer a high
yield, yeah, but if they're
uh,
sitting as reserves, then that means that they haven't been sold on. So then that means they have added to the money supply, doesn't it? That's government money that has added to the money supply.
no, because the reserves exist whether the bonds are owned by the banks or not.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. But when the yeah,
okay. So it doesn't matter whether it's cash or bonds. It's still
whether it represents funds which are owned by the banks or owned by the non-banks,
right.
because most of those bonds have been sold to the vampire squids and pension funds and so on. So
So a
about
bank buys $1 billion worth of bonds from the government, and then it's got
spells 950 million worth, and they end up in being part of the deposit accounts of the banks.
yeah,
So this is the whole cancellation thing we've been talking
yeah.
about. That when banks sell bonds to non-banks, they cancel the money that's been created by the deficit in the first place, and that what that means is the reserves exist whether the bonds have been owned by the banks or the non-banks. So as I said, there's something of the order of 300 times as much funds available for buying bonds as is necessary for each auction. So then the management process, and the book, there's a wonderful research article by Josh Ryan Collins and a couple of other people from UCL about the self-financing state that explains how the UK system works, because the mechanics are such that they make sure the Treasury's account at the central bank starts at zero each day. can go into overdraft and then gets back to zero during the day. So there's lots of financial machinations by the central bank buying and selling bonds and so on to make sure that level is maintained. But it means that the bonds are always oversubscribed. So there's absolutely no danger of the bonds not being purchased in the initial auction.
No.
But we've got this huge
So
outstanding reserves.
this argument that if we get too much government debt, then that's going to push up the cost of borrowing doesn't stack up on that basis.
Doesn't stack up at all. It goes the opposite direction. Because so what I'd prefer to see, this is currently illegal, but I'd prefer to see all this nonsense is caused by bonds and myths about bonds being the same as private debt, etc., etc. And we never used to pay interest on reserves. And now after the financial crisis, because quantitative easing created such a huge level of reserves for the private banks, then they had a dead asset, an asset which they couldn't trade and which earned no income for the banks, which was a double negative for them.
Yeah.
And that's why the banks were willing to buy bonds, because they'd go from zero interest rate to a positive interest rate, and they'd go from a non-tradable asset to a tradable asset. That's why they're willing to go into it. Then with the increase in interest rates that those central banks have caused around the world, purportedly to reduce the rate of inflation, that actually reduces the value of bonds. So that's actually increased the fragility of the financial sector,
Right.
because the longer dated bonds almost fall in proportion. If interest rates go up by a factor of 5, then the value of the bonds goes down by almost a factor of 5. That's made the financial sector quite fragile. It'd be easier to say, let the central bank buy the bonds, and what will happen is the banks will get huge amounts of reserves, which will pay interest on to them, so they get a payment for the cost of maintaining the financial system that we need the payment system the banks have created. Let's do that. The central bank buys all the bonds. When the government runs a deficit, it increases the reserves that are necessarily held by the private banks. When that happens, we get huge amounts of reserves. We pay banks an interest rate on it, and that's a compensation for the costs of running the payment system. And then we might get out of this total nonsense we're caught up in the moment about being obsessed about the level of government bonds.
Right. Okay. Many more thoughts on that. And our topic today is government debt actually helping the rich more than it's helping the poor? The other part of that question is, well, how do we fix that situation? We'll look at more of that when we come back after the break on the Debunking Economics podcast. So, Steve, you were talking in the first part about how banks are holding much greater level of reserves than they have done in the past, because in the past, I guess it was like an obligatory thing, wasn't it? You've got to have enough in reserves. It was basically stipulated how much you have to have in reserves. Now it's sort of like, well, if we're getting interest on it, we might as well get as much as we can, I guess.
It came out of the financial crisis, and the response of the central banks was to believe that if they created more reserves, the banks would lend the reserves out. Now, this is a complete myth, and the neoclassical economists teach the model they call the money multiplier. And that says that you deposit money at the bank, and the bank then hangs on to 10% of what you deposit and lends out 90%, and that's what creates money. That's their model. Now, when I do the accounting in Ravel, and it's simple to do, you find that it's the only way that could actually work as a way to create money would be if all loans are in cash. I said that to a couple of I've got a couple of friends in the Austrian circle. There's a guy called Bob Murphy, who's a damn good bloke. Unlike a lot of Austrians, you can actually have a laugh with Bob. His feature, he loves doing karaoke, and he's not a bad singer. So Bob just couldn't believe it. So that's nonsense. It doesn't matter what the loan's in. You can make the loan in cash, or you can make the loan in deposit. No difference. No, you do the accounting. And if you think you can give somebody a loan by reducing reserves and then putting the equivalent positive amount in the deposit accounts, you actually violate the laws of accounting. You've got a minus for the assets, and then you have a plus for the liabilities, and they don't cancel. The mathematics is wrong. And in fact, any bank that did that would find its assets falling and its liabilities rising.
Right.
It'd go bankrupt in rate of knots.
I suspect it's going through that step by step is a conversation for another day. I think
it is a bit complicated.
We've only got 10 or 15 minutes left today.
Don't worry about that.
But if we're in a situation where governments are holding more now in the way of either holding or selling on more in the way of bonds, Therefore, governments can just keep on issuing those bonds, and more of them will find their way into the finance sector, helping the wealthy. And that's the
Yeah.
problem, isn't it? I mean, it's fine maybe to say, well, we want to make sure that we are maintaining the health service and we are providing education and we are providing more now than ever defense for a nation. We need to make sure that we are looking after the poor as well as the wealthy. The issue is the more that we do that, so long as we're issuing it in bonds and those are being bought by the wealthy are benefiting potentially more than the poor out of this situation. So what's the way
Yeah.
out of that, which you were saying in the first part, really is
Would
the,
be as
the
the central
banks,
bank buys the bonds.
yeah,
Okay. And that, I mean,
which is what we saw during the pandemic, obviously.
yeah, they did on a grand scale. And also, that was quantitative easing was the same thing. But
Yeah.
I'd like to say, look, if you're complaining about the level of government debt, you're terrified about the level of government debt, we won't create any for you anymore.
Mm.
We'll sell the bonds directly to the central bank because all that bonds do when you do the accounting, all the bond sales actually do is make sure that the Treasury's account at the central bank doesn't go into overdraft. That's what the bonds do.
Yeah.
And you could do that equally. You can either sell the bonds to the banks themselves, or you could sell the bonds directly to the central bank. Now, if you did the central bank sales, all those bonds would accumulate at the central bank. The government pays no interest on bonds that are owned by the central bank, so the interest payments to the government would disappear. The reserves would turn up in the banks, and they couldn't get rid of the reserves unless they get transferred out in cash, or they also get transferred out by net imports. But the banks would just have reserves, and the pension funds and the wealthy could no longer buy the bonds, and they wouldn't be getting the interest payment
Take
anymore.
me through that step very quickly. So the central bank is buying them. So it's sitting. Oh, it issued. So the central bank is buying them from the
From
banks.
the
And
Treasury.
okay, so how is that sitting then in the reserves of the individual commercial banks then?
Well, if you have the government spends more than it takes back in taxation. That means down at the level of private banks, it increases deposit accounts
Oh yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
it increases the reserves. So
yeah,
the deposit accounts, which are the
yeah.
liabilities of the bank, they increase by the
Yeah.
deficit.
So
The reserves,
the government issues a billion. That's a billion that has to go somewhere. So it goes into the banks, into the commercial banks for the recipients' accounts. So it sits in the reserves there, and rather than issuing bonds, they are issuing bonds, but the bonds are being bought directly by the central
but the
bank.
central bank,
Right.
yeah.
So it's a
So
billion. So
the
it's
reserves will just
straightforward.
sit there.
That's a billion new money created.
Yeah, a billion new money created, a billion extra in reserves,
Right.
and the bonds are owned by the central bank. So because the central bank's assets rise because they've bought the bonds, and it matches the increase in the liabilities from the uh, uh, oh, it's hang on, I've got to. It does take even I've got to stop and to think about the actual double entry going on there. But if you had the Treasury issuing bonds, then the revenue for the bonds turns up in the Treasury's account, and that revenue matches the increase in the assets owned by the central bank. So the Treasury account does not go into overdraft. And then down at the private bank level, all they'd get is the reserves, and therefore you couldn't sell. There wouldn't be bonds for the private banks to sell to the wealthy.
Right. Okay.
So if you did that, you'd have government debt would be owned by the government, so therefore the government debt is zero. You'd have no interest payments being made to the bondholders because the bondholders now be the central bank. And the people who are complaining about the level of government debt and how dangerous it is and how we have to cut back on spending for the poor,
Yeah.
otherwise we're going to have too much government debt, they wouldn't be getting an income. I reckon they'd be the first ones to complain about the lack of a deficit or the lack of bonds being issued
Yeah.
for the deficit.
But
I'd just like to
they're
see.
not complaining now, are they? Because they are
No, they're
saying,
getting a fortune out of it.
yeah,
Yeah.
but they are also, the same people, ironically, who are saying, yes, there's too much government debt. Maybe because they are worried about the yield. They think it is going to impact the yield. But as you say, that's a bogus argument when you say that all auctions are oversubscribed. But they'd be saying, well, look, we need austerity. We don't want the government issuing any more bonds. There's enough bonds. We don't want any more. So the government needs to stop issuing. We need austerity now. So we stay wealthy and the poor struggle. I mean, and that is where we are now, not just in the UK, all over the world. It's like austerity was a bad thing. It didn't do, we can look and see in the data that 10 years of it basically brought the economy to a screeching halt. But never mind that. Let's do it all over again, which is precisely where we are now with a Labour government in the UK, basically saying, yes, let's bring on austerity.
Yeah, it's weird. It's beyond a joke. So in that sense, my joking policy is actually a serious one. If you want to get rid of government debt, let the central bank buy the bonds
Right.
directly, let them buy all the outstanding bonds, and then who would complain about it? Not the poor, but the rich, because suddenly the income source you've been, this
Yeah.
episode's about would be taken away from them, and they'd start complaining and say, "But we've got rid of the government debt. Weren't you worried about it? Don't you want to get rid of it?"
Yeah.
It would undermine the whole argument for austerity. And it would mean that rather than pumping up the wealthy, which is what bond sales to the non-bank sector actually do when they're high yielding, it'd end that income flow to the wealthy. So I think it'd be a damn sensible policy change to let the central bank buy the bonds directly. Therefore, banks would only have reserves. They wouldn't have bonds to sell to the private sector. We'd have to change the pension system. We might even have to pay people decent pensions again.
So
Okay? Because
why are central banks so keen to unwind their balance sheets? They sit there nervously and saying, "Well, we've got to get rid of this. We're holding too many government bonds directly. We've got to get rid of it." Why that impetus? Why do they feel the need to do that?
again, it comes back to neoclassical theory and neoclassical ideology. They think actually I don't know that one. I've got to think about why. What would be a
Well,
neoclassical argument against the central bank holding
well,
bonds?
they just say if we
And
drip feed it, we can expand the money supply. Maybe that's part of it.
yeah, well, they've got the idea that reserves. I mean, yeah, when I read neoclassical
But they
theory
wouldn't
these
actually. If they
days,
drip feed it, they're actually reducing the money supply, aren't they?
yeah, yeah. So it's just it's
Mm,
a. I mean, the whole thing is a shadow play,
mm,
a false vision of how the financial system operates that leads to false ideas about what's a good idea, and that's led to the fact we're in a set of rolling financial crises ever since the Maggie Thatcher days.
mm.
Rather than stability, we've got
Well,
instability.
yeah. But is it are they using it as a monetary instrument? Is that what they're saying? And this is all relatively new for them, of course, as well, because quantitative easing was sort of like what they see as being an irregular market activity. But I guess they could use the rationale that if we start selling some of these bonds off that we hold, then people are going to buy them. Therefore, it's going to shrink the money supply, and that's going to slow down the economy. So that's going to control inflation. That would be their argument, wouldn't it?
I think they'd see a way in which the bond system controls the financial
Mm,
system. So yeah, but the bond market, they're terrified of the bond market at the same time. But one of the little sayings from traders in America is "Don't fight the Fed." And the reason they say that is because if the Fed wants to buy all outstanding bonds, it could do it tomorrow.
yeah.
It's got literally that buying power because when the Fed buys bonds, what it does is say, "Oh, we'd like to buy those, $40 trillion worth of bonds off you. We're going to put the number 40 trillion in your reserve accounts, and you're going to transfer those bonds ownership to us. So we put 40 trillion on our asset side, and that's the end of it, and the debt's all gone.
Mm.
Aren't you all happy?" And then suddenly the bond market has got absolutely no bonds to trade. They'd be hell to pay because the fortunes that they earn out of bond speculation, the infrastructure that's there to buy and sell bonds is gigantic. It's by far the biggest financial market on the planet. There'd be lots of very unhappy people in Wall Street and unhappy people in the city, and I'd be so upset for
But
them. I really would.
ironically, I think there's a greater chance of that happening in America than now more than ever before. It's the sort of thing if Donald Trump could stack the central bank with his people, it's the sort of thing he might actually look at doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's that'd be fun, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, he,
Uh,
he wants interest rates low. He doesn't, you could see him saying, yes, well, this is a good way of
buy all the
government.
bonds.
Yeah. Buy
Put
all the,
somebody in charge of the central bank who does what I want and buy all the bonds off, and
yeah.
and then
And don't
the
worry about the
bonds just
independent central
disappear
bank independence because really it's just another arm of treasury. In fact, the next
with
stage.
another arm of his pocket.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well, he
yeah,
might
that
do.
could happen.
Yeah. So okay. So the only downside to all of that is inflation, isn't it? So if
Well,
if
that you would
that
if
if you're creating that trillion or billion, let's call it, or 100 billion
yeah.
in government spending, which is not issued as bonds, which are bought on the open market or bought by banks, it's all bought by the central bank direct from the treasury. That is 100 billion into the economy.
Yeah, you would get a
100%.
huge increase in the money supply. That is because when you buy the bonds off the banks, you don't change the money supply.
So
When you buy
you'd have to
bonds
keep
off
an eye on that.
non-banks, you do change the money supply. So yeah, you would have a surge in the amount of money in the system. So it's not absolutely straightforward by any means, but it's completely feasible to
It's a
have that
mechanism you
happen.
just have to control. That's all. You could
Yeah,
say, well,
or what
okay.
you could do,
With the
you could
balancing
do it from
mechanism is we're going to say, well, some of this we are going to issue
yeah.
so we are going to issue some of it out onto the open market, and some of it's going to get bought by the central bank. It's just
Or what you do is you do it for new bonds. You leave the existing bonds where they are, but all the new bonds get sold to the central bank. And then that way the reserves get created, but they can't be transferred from the banks. They can't be transferred from reserves into bonds. The bonds therefore can't be sold
mm,
to the private sector. So more government money creation would actually turn up in the economy. And if you directed that towards money creation for welfare, education, housing, etc., you'd have government creation doing what MMT currently believes it does, which it doesn't because of the amount of money creation cancelled by those bond sales. So get rid of it. It's quite a feasible thing to do.
going
And
up,
let the bonds that exist mature and die.
going off at a slightly different tangent, which is dangerous because we've only got a few minutes to cover this. But there is another aspect as well, isn't it? The government invests in stuff like infrastructure projects, like for example now renewable projects, green initiatives, which
Mm.
is using government money. The fact that the government is there investing in those initiatives, very often with that public private partnership type investments, the fact that government money is in there is inflating the value of what's being created, those assets, so that people who put private money into it are benefiting as well. So here's another case of government money might be helping the rich more than it's helping the poor.
Well, the public partnerships, PPPs, and and they've we use those for infrastructure. We don't have to. This is again
Mm,
not understanding government money creation, but yeah, you end up handing over a cash flow like so many tollways, and particularly as we both know in Australia,
yep.
have been done with PPPs, and it means that the working class driving to their factories are paying money to the people who have got those so-called shared partnerships, and again, it's a transfer from the poor to the rich. Sounding more like Marx every day, isn't it? The government is the managing system for the bourgeoisie.
And then the other one is, when a rich person borrows money and creates money as a result of borrowing, they're using it to
Mm.
buy assets which are giving them a good return. So they're getting wealthier from the money that they're borrowing. If a poor person borrows money, first of all, they'll pay more for it because the bank will charge them a higher interest rate because they are a less
They're stuck
safe
in
bet.
payday lending, yeah,
And they are using that money to cover their
to consume,
essentials. So not all
yeah,
debt, whereas in fact, you'd be thinking, well, actually, it should be charged the other way, shouldn't it? You're getting a greater return, rich are getting a greater return. So not all loans are equal. And, we ignore that aspect of it as well.
yeah. I mean, there's a huge reason to reform the financial system,
Mm.
the opposite direction what's been done in the last 40 or 50 years.
Yeah. But you could also get over that issue about the poor having to borrow money by just making sure they got more from government spending.
Because it paid them decent pensions. A
Yeah.
whole huge part of this, the privatization, growth of superannuation systems and 401ks, etc., was to take pensions off the government books and make the government books look better. That was a mistake.
Mm.
The government should pay a decent pension.
Yeah. Pure and simple. All right. Well, we've solved the problem there, Steve.
There you go,
All we
as
need to do
always. Yeah,
is re-educate everyone. That's all.
and
That's
take over the play government. Yeah, I think I'll make you. Do you want to be king or would you prefer to be prime minister?
king. Sounds like less work.
King.
Yeah,
There you
I
go.
think so.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just have to
Okay.
appear
King
occasionally.
Dobby.
Yeah, I just
King
appear at
Phil. Yeah.
occasions. Every so often, just put on the regalia. Nothing too
Just don't
camp.
go to American Open. Don't go to the Wimbledon and get a reception like Donald Trump got yesterday at the American Open.
Oh well, that was a couple of weeks ago now. Of course, you're
No, no.
losing.
Oh, of course it was. Yeah, yeah. Pardon me.
Can't you can take a horse to
Sorry.
water? You can't teach it to drink. All right, very good.
Sorry about that.
Well, yes, because here we are in late September, Steve. Anyway,
That's true.
we'll catch you next week. Next week, I'm going to be in Sydney. The sun will be shining, and then like 5 weeks worth coming from Parramatta. So look forward to that. We'll catch you then. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, mate. Bye. Sorry about that, mate.